Hello, welcome to North Country History. I'm Rob Berg, and I'm going to present to you this week a history of the early logging industry in Michigan. When we talk about logging in Michigan, we are generally looking at the time period of 1840 to 1910 for the white pine lumber industry. That's when the industry figured on the U.S. Census as one of the important industries in Michigan. Logging was king, particularly in the northern half of the Lower Peninsula and in the Upper Peninsula during that 70-year time period. However, it was not always the top industry in Michigan. And logging didn't just all of a sudden begin in 1840 and end in 1910. It actually was earlier than that, as early as settlement, European colonist, American colonist settlement in Michigan, up through to after 1910. Logging really went into the 1920s, even the 1930s in scattered areas. But it was during that 70-year period that the height of the logging of the white pine, but really it took off after the end of the American Civil War, when there was a great demand for need for lumber in what was then the Western United States. What we look at today is the Midwest. White pine really served that area, but we were cutting pine in Michigan even before then. And that's what I'm going to look at today in this episode. We're going to look at focusing from the, really we'll just talk about the Michigan Territory period. I'm not going to get into the colonial period yet at this time, but we'll look at it from about 1805 up through to the Civil War period. And I'm only going to do a little short bit on the early period, other than the need for lumber around Detroit and other settlements before, we weren't even considering shipping lumber to other locations yet at that point. So today, we'll talk about that, the logging in the early period of logging in Michigan, prior to it becoming, really a serious industry in our state. So let me take you as your guide on this exploration of early Michigan logging today on North Country History with Rob Berg. North Country History with Rob Berg, your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. Generations will cease to live before this will cease to be a branch of commerce, a vast resource. Freeman Hunt in the 1848 Merchants Magazine and Commercial Review. That is really the quote that sums up of when or how much lumber or forests were found in Michigan, of how long they could cut the lumber. There is an oft-mentioned saying that the white pine in Michigan would last 500 years, that it was an inexhaustible resource. I've never been able to find a direct quote stating 500 years. The closest that I found was this quote by Freeman Hunt. And I wasn't even the one that discovered it. It was my friend Kyle Bagnall, a fellow historian, naturalist, who shared that with me a number of years ago. And hopefully I'll get Kyle on as somebody to interview at some point here on the podcast, because he has a large amount of experience interpreting Michigan's forests like I have. And he's currently the chief naturalist for the Mackinac Island Historic Park. So there's a lot to talk to him about with forest history when it's regarding such as the fur trade of the colonial period. But that's another episode, and I've yet to even approach Kyle. So, hey, if you're listening to this, Kyle, this is my invitation to talk to you at a later point. So, but anyways, let's get back to early logging here in Michigan. And as I mentioned there, Freeman Hunt, a journalist in Chicago who had the Merchants Magazine and Commercial Review, basically a business magazine of the time period, and he wrote a whole issue basically on the industry of the Northwest, which was then, of course, what we call the Great Lakes region today, the old Northwest Territory that included what became the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. Lumber, of course, figured in prominently in that area and really beginning in the 1840s as an industry. But our white pine here in Michigan was important even prior to that. Detroit was found as a city, as a settlement by the French in 1701. So we've just celebrated its 323rd birthday, I believe that was, just a month ago. And so it's been around a while, a lot longer than most people realize, of settlement in the Great Lakes by Europeans. Even older were the settlements at the Straits of Mackinac, St. Ignace, Michilimackinac, now Mackinac City, Mackinac Island. That dates to the 1600s. Sault Ste. Marie dates to the 1600s, both on the American and Canadian sides of the St. Mary's River. So at these areas where there was settlement, there was a need for lumber, for building local needs. So there was always some sort of lumber industry in the area. It just really focused on the local needs rather than shipping it elsewhere, exporting it to the east, or as it later would be, to the west. So today we're going to focus on kind of that development as an industry, and we're going to look specifically at the Detroit area. Detroit as a city, as I mentioned, or as a settlement, was founded in 1701 by Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac. And of course, you may recognize the Cadillac name. They named an auto company in his honor. And then also Cadillac, Michigan, named after him in his honor as well. Sieur de Cadillac, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce it correctly in French, something I ever failed to learn. But Sieur de Cadillac was a officer of the French army, was an explorer, and he was sent to reestablish French authority in the Great Lakes region. It had been abandoned due to the wars with Britain and with the native conflicts between the Iroquois in the east, and the Algonquin in the Great Lakes region, and the French had abandoned their post at Michilimackinac, at that time St. Ignace, Fort de Bois, and they felt there was a need to reestablish their importance, or their contact in the area, their presence in the area. And Cadillac came down across from the Ottawa River through the portages to the Lake Huron to Georgian Bay, and came down Lake Huron, the traditional route that they used because they avoided the contact with the Iroquois, who were friendly with the British in what became New York, as opposed to where they came through this way. They were through with their allies, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and other Algonquian natives, along with the Huron or Wendat, which were Iroquois, but were not part of the Confederation that opposed French. So they came down from Lake Huron, came down through the St. Clair River, Lake St. Clair, and into the Straits of Detroit, the Detroit River as we know it today. And they found a location there after having explored a little further down towards Lake Erie, and then came back up and decided to site at the location we now know today as Detroit. And they had to build. They built a stockaded wall for basically a fortified village. That's what Fort Pontchartrain, the original name of the area, was known as. And so they had to cut trees in the area. Likely there was a lot of local hardwood in the area, along with a scattering of pine. But just a little bit ways north of Lake St. Clair, going up towards Port Huron and the Black River and that area of the Thumb, that was really the start of the white pine region in Michigan. I don't know if they floated any pine down to Detroit for the construction of the original settlement of Detroit, but that would become a source of lumber as Detroit grew over the next century. And after the 1805 fire that burned the growing town of Detroit, can't really call it a city yet in 1805, but there was a major fire in 1805 that destroyed Detroit. And this was right at the time when Detroit had become the capital of the brand new Michigan Territory. It was the largest settlement in Michigan Territory, so naturally it would become the capital. And Detroit would remain the capital of not just Michigan Territory, but the state of Michigan, up until 1845 when the capital was moved to Lansing, to a little bit more of a central location, at least central to the then population in 1845. But through all this growth, there was always going to be a need for lumber. And so lumber was then cut, trees cut in the forest, and it would have to be milled into various forms of lumber for construction purposes. What we look at today as, the boards that we buy at lumber yards, at Home Depot, Lowe's, Menards, the basic 2x4s, 4x4s, any of the lumber like that we're going to use for construction purposes. Well, you couldn't go down to the local lumber yard or the big box store to purchase your lumber in 1805. It had to be produced at a sawmill, and you got it directly from the sawmill or a lumber yard adjacent to that sawmill where the retail sales were at. So the sawmills had to be created, and at this time, the best way to power a sawmill was through water power. And I mentioned Mackinac earlier there. At the Mackinac Historic Parks on the mainland, Mill Creek, they have a recreation of a water-powered sawmill. And I always recommend anybody, if they get a chance, to go up and visit that sawmill, because you're going to see how the lumber was cut early on, up until the steam-powered sawmills really took off in the 1830s and the 1840s and beyond. The slower water-powered ones, either with a water wheel or a form of a water turbine that was connected then up to the mechanisms of the lumber or the sawing equipment up in the mill. And that would have been the way to power that saw, an up and down saw that was basically just a large crosscut saw that you would use for cutting the logs, splitting them, ripping them through with the saw. It was attached to the mechanisms powered by that water, like I said, either a water wheel or a turbine, and that could cut a bit faster than what you could cut just by hand. So it wasn't a fast way to cut. I mean, it was faster than by hand, but it wasn't nearly as fast as the technology would develop in the 1850s, the 70s, the 80s, as it became really the industry in Michigan. After Michigan achieved statehood in 1837, the surveys of the new state of Michigan could commence. While we were still a territory, federal surveys did not take place. It was all unorganized land, and but once the borders of the new state were settled, from the Toledo Strip, that had been the kind of the controversy that delayed the statehood of Michigan because of our little spat with Ohio over Toledo, up through the not just the eastern third of the Upper Peninsula that was going to be part of the state of Michigan, but all the way through of what we see now as the modern Upper Peninsula boundaries that was given after that spat with Ohio, commonly known as the Toledo War, over who rightfully owned Toledo. we lost, and we got the Upper Peninsula as consolation. I love my friends in Toledo, and the city of Toledo is a great place, but I'm frankly really glad that we got the western two-thirds of the Upper Peninsula in compensation for the loss of Toledo. Not only did we have the great lumber resources that I'm covering here in this podcast, but also the little-known copper that was, it was already known, but it wasn't really understood the extent of the wealth of the copper deposits. And at that point, iron had been undiscovered yet in the Upper Peninsula as well. So the Upper Peninsula really helped drive Michigan's economy during the 19th century. And thank you, Ohio, for that. And sorry, Wisconsin, that you didn't get the other two-thirds of the Upper Peninsula. So once these borders were settled, surveying of the land could commence. And the surveyors, they not only had to lay out the the legal boundaries of Michigan, developing it based on the meridian and baselines, which for those of you who aren't aware, there is the baseline is an east-west line, and it's where we start for north and south surveys. And then the meridian is a north-south line, and that is to determine east and west. The baseline in Michigan, where they commenced the surveying, is Baseline Road that goes across the southern lower peninsula. In southeast Michigan, it's best known as 8 Mile Road in Detroit. It is the boundary between Wayne and Oakland County and goes all the way across to Lake Michigan from the Detroit River, Lake St. Clair area. And that is the north-south or the east-west line. And then, north-south, everything north of the baseline and south of the baseline. And then the meridian is Meridian Road, and that is would go through Hillsdale, Jackson, Ingham County, and then north all the way up to the Straits of Mackinac or Lake Huron area. And Meridian Road in the Lansing area is where it's best known at. And so all the surveys then start from there, and they were doing it what they call the township. And it was these sections, and usually it's 6 1 square mile sections that were then made into a township. So it was 6 by 6, and that would be 36 square miles that you would have then, which would be into a township. And they're all broken up into your sections, into your half sections, your quarter sections. And so land could be sold at from various acreage of that. A quarter section was about 160 acres, and that was usually the minimum of land that most people purchased in the 19th century. And when the creation of the Homestead Act during the American Civil War to encourage settlement in the West, it was usually a quarter section of 160 acres that people could file for, that if they worked it and improved it within 5 years, it would then be free and clear. They would earn that 160 acres for no additional cost. So that's what you're going to be looking at the surveys. But while they're doing that surveys, because they want to show if that land is marketable or valuable for real estate for people to settle on, they're going to look at what's on that land. And they would list all the various types of trees that were found on there. And this is where you're going to start seeing the amount of pine that we had in Michigan. Logging obviously did not start right here in Michigan, logging of the white pine. The white pine, having, as I mentioned in previous episode, the green gold episode, that logging had begun along the East Coast in what became Maine and into other reaches of New England, New York State, Pennsylvania, and also in Canada, in New Brunswick, in Quebec, in Ontario. before it reached out here into the Great Lakes region, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the likes. So they were quite aware of this pine, that of the value of white pine. But through these surveys, they were really astonished, many of these surveyors who had experience in places like Maine and New York State, that the amount that we had here far surpassed what they were seeing there in the East, where a lot of their forests were much more mixed. And the pine wasn't as concentrated there as it is here in Michigan, or at least was when they were looking at these surveys in the 1830s, the 1840s, the 1850s. And that's where they realized that this pine is going to last, again, what they believed, forever. But that was also based on the logging technology at the time. Sawmills, as I mentioned, many of them were still water-powered sawmills. And it was only by the 1840s that circular saws had begun to be replacing the up and down saws that were directly operated by water power, and steam power was now being introduced, which could cut faster, but again, not nearly as fast as technology later. When the bandsaw was developed in the 1870s, that was a much cleaner and faster way of cutting. If you've ever watched a circular saw go, and it looks like it's going pretty straight and everything, but if you can watch it on camera or on film and then slow down that camera, you're going to see that as that saw cuts, that circular saw, it's attached in the middle, but the outer ends of that circle wobbles, and it doesn't cut straight. So it has what we call a thick kerf, or the wide kerf there. The kerf is the cut, and you're going to lose a lot of lumber during that cut. It doesn't seem like a lot when you're thinking of just cutting off one board. But when they're cutting a large 3-foot, 4-foot diameter log back and forth consistently, you're losing quite a bit of lumber there that could be used. So this was inefficient, and it was slower, much slower than the bandsaws. And also, when they were cutting in the forest, they were only using axes. Now, an axe is a great way to cut a tree down, but compared to the crosscut saws that were perfected in the 1870s, it was slow. 2 men to cut down, we'll say, a 3.5-foot diameter white pine tree. It's going to take them about 30 minutes to cut that tree down with axes. And that's one swinging his axe, chopping into the tree. As he pulls back, the second man swings his axe in and chops into the tree. So they are really nonstop cutting for most of that 30 minutes. They're going to stop, take a short break, catch their breath. Sometimes they may have to take a little bottle of kerosene and with a rag wipe their axes blades, because they start to get sticky with sap, and that starts to dull their blade, or it will slow down their cutting as wood chips stick to their blade. They want to keep that nice and clean. So you're looking at optimally 2 men cutting down. They're cutting down 2 trees an hour. You're looking at maybe a 10-hour workday based on the amount of daylight that they've got available. They're cutting in the wintertime, so probably less than that. It might even be, closer to the 8-hour workday. That's not all chopping of their trees during that, but you're looking at, we'll go with 10 hours, 20 trees max in a day. And sounds like a lot, but compared to, again, what's going to be done 30 years later, that is not nearly as fast as how things would happen. And during this time period, a crew cutting lumber in the forest is probably no more than about 20 men in a logging camp. And not all of them are going to actually be cutting the trees down. Maybe you've only got 5 crews, 10 men of cutting the trees down. You have teamsters that are hauling the logs out with their horses or oxen at that time. You've got the camp boss who's dealing with all the administrative work, but at that time he's probably also the foreman out in the forest as well. A camp cook, a blacksmith. So, you're looking that only part of your labor force is actually going to be cutting the trees. So, that's not bad. And they're only cutting in the wintertime. At this time, the only good way to moving the logs was in the winter on a road made out of snow and ice, on sleighs pulled by horses or oxen. And then in the springtime, wait for the snow to melt, and all those rivers are running fast, and you're going to move the logs down the rivers, float them to the sawmill. That's going to most likely be at the mouth of the river, where then after the lumber's been cut into a more usable item, and then they're loaded up onto boats and shipped down to Detroit, or maybe across the Lake Erie to Buffalo, and on the Erie Canal to Albany, and down the Hudson River to New York. Later, they're going to be shipped to Chicago on the Lake Michigan and used there, or shipped further west via the Illinois and Michigan Canal or the new railroads out to the prairie states for the growing communities out on the prairie. So that's really lumber in the nutshell in the early period. As I mentioned, small crews. A logging camp's only going to be maybe a couple of buildings. You've got the combined bunkhouse and cook shanty in one building, and that was a lot. They called a lot of times the state of Maine camps. And right in the center of that building, instead of wood stoves, they're going to have this one large open hearth fireplace. It's basically what they called a camboose, a 10-foot by 12-foot box, raised logs filled with sand, and they're going to have their cooking fires on there. A large, what they call a crane, made out of steel or iron, where they hung the big cooking pots from over the fire. And instead of having a nice stone chimney rising up from there to the roof, it's just an open hole right in the ceiling or the roof of the building for the smoke to escape. As you can imagine, not all the smoke escaped out of that hole, and the building's going to be quite smoky. At one end of that camboose, on one side, is the what we call the cook shanty. That's where the cooks would have their preparation area, their tables, their where they would store their food and prepare it, and then a long table for the men to sit at to eat their meals at. And on the other end would be the bunks built in along the sides of the walls, and where they would sleep at while they are in the camp. Second building would be the barn to hold the animals, and also to hold hay and other feed for them. Even the horses survive mostly on hay at the logging camps. We know that horses like a more varied diet, add in oats and other grains, but they can survive on hay. It's just not preferred to have them as a healthy horse, but they could still do the work on hay, which would be the cheapest and easiest way to provide food for them. There'd probably also be the blacksmith shop in there attached to the barn, and that's where the blacksmith could work on the repairs of any tools, equipment, and he and a farrier, and sometimes maybe just the blacksmith, would work as a farrier as well and shoe the horses, and if necessary, the oxen as well. Shoeing oxen is a much more difficult job than putting horseshoes on a horse. Few other areas in there, an office and maybe a little store for the men to purchase items, but really a small camp. By the end of the 1800s, a logging camp in Michigan might have 100 men in there, usually 50 to 60 for a normal, but there were camps as large as 100, and even a few scattered ones of 200 men and women and families in a logging camp. So you could see that the growth of the camps would be quite a bit larger by the end of the 19th century. I also mentioned that cutting of the trees at this time, it took about 30 minutes with two men using a crosscut saw. Later, they're going to be cutting using two men 30 minutes using the double-bladed axes. Later, the crosscut saw would come in, and that would, pun intended here, cut the time in half. From 30 minutes for 2 men to cut the tree down, it was now about 15 minutes to cut the tree down. The faster speed of using the crosscut saw meant they could cut down twice as many trees in the same amount of time. So instead of 2 trees an hour, it was now 4 trees an hour. If you're looking at a 10-hour day of working or of cutting of 20 trees a day, now you're looking at 40 trees a day. Believe it or not, the men objected to this initially because they thought with doubling the speed, they're going to need less men working in the woods. So they objected to it. Many of them refused to switch over to the crosscut saw. But what instead happened is that they just started cutting more trees, larger amounts, and along with the introduction of the railroad into logging, which means they could go further than the cutting near the rivers, and they could cut year-round. They didn't need to worry about snow. Our forest disappeared much quicker. So that 500 years, or as Freeman Hunt said, generations will cease to live before this will cease to be a branch of commerce, a vast resource. It became a limited resource. And even by the 1880s, it was now being seen that our forests in Michigan were disappearing. And the demand for lumber, of course, increased as well. One of the greatest demands for Michigan lumber came from the Transcontinental Railroad. The construction of that from 1866 to 1869 was a huge user of Michigan lumber. And I really encourage anybody to travel west along the lines, go through Nebraska, Wyoming, out into Utah on the Union Pacific line, and you can see where they were going through here. There's no forest. I lived for almost 4 years in Grand Island, Nebraska on the Platte River, and it was the route of the Union Pacific. And except in the river bottoms there's no trees through there. There's cottonwoods, and they did log off or cut down all the cottonwood in the area to use for railroad ties. But they really had to ship in a lot more lumber from Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota to be able to build the railroad line. And they get out to Dale Creek in Wyoming. There's a huge gully there that the stream goes through, and they had to bridge across it. And they built that bridge, the initial trestle, completely from Michigan white pine. It was cut to order. It was assembled in Chicago to make sure it was the right amount that they needed, and then it was disassembled and sent to Wyoming and rebuilt there. So that was really the turning point for the great demand for lumber in the West. And then, of course, all of the communities that came that arose on the Great Plains after that. We'll do an episode here later on the podcast of From the Great Lakes to the Great Plains and the demand of lumber that really changed the industry. A little thing happened, though, shortly before the takeoff of the lumber industry and the Transcontinental Railroad. You might know it, it's called the American Civil War. Yeah, my sarcasm there about it being a little event. It changed, of course, our country, and it affected the white pine industry just as much as it affected everything else. During that period of the Civil War, there was some cutting still going on, but of course not anything like it would be afterwards, and even nothing like it was, coming up to the war. So many of the men, the lumbermen, the lumberjacks as we call them, shanty boys as they called themselves, they quit, they left the woods, and they volunteered for the Union cause. And there were regiments that served from Michigan, a lot of them in the Western Theater, what we don't think of as West now, but Kentucky, Tennessee, and kind of along the Mississippi River, and those that went down followed with Sherman down in the March to the Sea through Georgia. Many of those men came from Michigan, or came from the forests, and the Michigan Regiment of Engineers, I'm not sure on the number of it right now. I'll have to look that up, and we'll get back in another episode. But they were an engineering regiment, and they helped to rebuild railroads. And of course, to rebuild railroads, you needed lumber to do that. And so these lumberjacks were quite handy to have available to help rebuild those railroads. And it was a constant job. As they reconstructed a railroad, Confederate raiders would come back through and cut those railroad lines. And it was a constant repair, rebuild that took place until the end of the war. So early logging in Michigan, it was not the industry that we think of as the post-Civil War period up until the end of the 19th century. But it was something that was always greatly needed. And it started around the Detroit area, the Thumb, Port Huron, the Black River, as I mentioned. That was the first important lumber river in Michigan. And it quickly curled up around the other side of the Thumb to the Saginaw Bay. And you had lumber then going up through the Saginaw River Valley. And that included rivers coming in from the Thumb, the Cass River, the Flint River, but also a little bit south, the Shiawassee River. And then along from the Saginaw River, you had the Tittabawassee and its tributaries that included the Tobacco River, the Molasses River, the Pine River, the Chippewa River, all of these rivers that flowed into the great Saginaw Valley. That became Michigan's biggest lumber area, lumber region, until the Muskegon River that flowed into Lake Michigan at Muskegon, and that stretched all the way up 200 plus miles up to Houghton Lake and Higgins Lake. Those two lumber regions that really took off after the Civil War is what really made our lumber industry in Michigan. And again, I'll be talking about these in future episodes. So thanks for bearing with me today. You got to hear a little bit about the early logging industry in Michigan, and it really did set the tone for a really not only a economic boom for our state, but ecologically, environmentally, it permanently changed the face of Michigan. And of course, by the end of the time period, by 1910, when most of the lumbermen had pretty much abandoned our state or had switched to other industries or retired, that there was such a need for the reforestation. So as you will see, as you will hear, I keep thinking as a visual interpreter, that you're going to learn a little bit about the changes of our forests, not just in Michigan, but in the entire Great Lakes region. And lumber was along with the fur trade, were the beginning of that great change. So thanks again for bearing with me. And as always, if you really enjoy what you're hearing here, please tell a friend and hit that subscribe button on whichever way that you're listening to the podcast here, be it on my personal YouTube channel, North Country History, or on whichever podcast provider that you listen to. Thanks again, and I hope you'll be listening in again on a future episode. Have a good day. Bye. North Country History with Rob Berg is hosted, written, and produced by Rob Berg. Music is Crack o' Dawn, performed by Reveille, licensed through Soundstripe. Follow North Country History with Rob Berg on YouTube and on Facebook at Rob Berg, Environmental Historian.